Good morning, James. How are you? My head is spinning, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. Now, I snapped that photo that I have behind this slide. That is the corner store, the milk bar around the corner from my house. It had been closed for the duration of the pandemic. And then last week, this appears again in front of it. We are open again 7 days. There was much rejoicing in the neighborhood that you didn't have to go all the way down to the mall. We're starting to now, I guess, come out the other side. The speakers were talking about this. I'm calling this the chronic phase of the pandemic rather than the acute phase of the pandemic. And what I really want to do is talk about what the future is going to be like during this chronic phase. Now, I do a very sort of, I guess, interesting podcast. Hopefully, all of you will listen to it. Hang on a second. Getting a message there from the app called The Next Billion Seconds. And The Next Billion Seconds is so named because as a futurist, that's a good length of time to be working in. It's about 31 years, a couple of months. And as a futurist, when I get asked by clients to look up the future, they ask me to look 5, 10, 15 years, occasionally 30 years into the future. And you can generally make really good predictions about that period of time because as a futurist, you can expect there's going to be a certain amount of change per unit time. And then this happened. And all of a sudden, because of the virus, the pace of change in March and April of 2020 basically exceeded all of the rest of all of our entire previous lives. And all of a sudden, our ability to plan successfully 5 or 10 or 15 years into the future, it really started to collapse. I call this the forward planning horizon. That's the horizon that we can look out on, and we can reasonably expect things to be the same as they were the day before, or the week before, or the month before. And all of a sudden, that began to change. And it began to change in March because of the exponential growth of the pandemic globally. We all knew this was happening because it was everywhere in the news, it was everywhere in the media, it was everywhere from the government that we had to do everything we could to control the exponential. We all got to be very good at reading exponential graphs and getting very worried about exponential growth because it took less than 60 days for something that was basically very far away, sort of over in China, and seemed to be very far away in time to become very clear, very near, and very dangerous. And so for a period of time there, the only thing that you could do was to digest news about how bad things were getting. I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago with a whole bunch of comms leaders, including the head of communications for Kohl's. And what she said was she would start out at the beginning of March with a plan for the comms for that day. And by the end of the day, not only had the plan changed a little bit, there would be a completely different plan. And this happened day after day after day. So much newness, so much novelty happened every single day that there was really no way to even plan from day to day. And this is what I mean when I talk about the forward planning horizon. It reached a crescendo here in Australia around the 12th of March. At that point, it became impossible to know hour to hour what was going to be different about the next hour. So the ability to confidently predict that the next hour was going to be the same as the hour that had preceded it, it had gone away. And that is the nature of the exponential growth of the pandemic. That is the thing that brought everything to a halt. Because the only thing that you can do when things are growing exponentially is hit the brick wall. All right. Basically, what happened was our normal ability to predict, to see out on the horizon, that horizon started to tip upward as the pandemic grew exponentially. And as the horizon tipped upward enough, the thing that looked like a horizon suddenly became a wall we plowed into. And the only thing that we could do was to bring everything to a complete stop. And so for a good period of time, second half of March, all of April, the world effectively shut down. And everything came to a stop. We all basically hid under the doona, to quote the Prime Minister, and we did what we could to get the pandemic under control. This is all in the name of what we know of as flattening the curve. And here in Australia, we have been extraordinarily successful flattening the curve, which means that we've reduced the rate of infections or reinfections or spread of infections of a very infectious illness to a very, very low level. As you've probably heard, yesterday was the first day since the beginning of the pandemic that Australia has recorded no cases of community transmissions of COVID-19, which is an incredible step. And of course, yesterday was also the first day that New Zealand basically went back to level 1, no restrictions at all. So now they're living as if they're in a COVID-free world. Now we'll come back to that because that's got problems of its own. But you can see what's happened. We've done the hard work. We are now in the chronic phase of the pandemic. And the whole goal in the chronic phase of the pandemic is to keep the reproduction rate, which is the figure that's on here, below 1, so that each case of COVID-19 produces less than 1 case. And that means that it will slowly peter out. And so everything that we're going to be doing as businesses over the next little while is actually going to have an eye on this reproduction number. That's why I've got this here, because it's going to frame the 4 big trends that we can see through to the end of 2020. Now, I have to tell you something. Again, as a futurist, I like being able to look out 5, 10, 15 years. I have never in my practice as a futurist tried to offer clients advice for what things are going to be like for, say, the next 6 months or next 7 months through to the end of the year. But now, in the world that we're living in, to be a futurist is to try to make predictions to the end of 2020. That's how much things have changed, and that's how short our horizon of predictability is, because there are a lot of unknowns out there. Of course, the one that we all talk about, but we all worry about is, will there be a second wave of infections? And the reproduction rate, and keeping that reproduction rate below 1, is the key to preventing that second wave. All right. Let's start to take a look at how that will factor into the 4 key trends for 2020. The first of those key trends is the transition from a sharing economy to a sterile economy. Now, on Saturday night, I took a taxi, or actually a share car, over to a friend's house for a dinner party. And I use Ola, I don't use Uber. When I opened the Ola app, which I hadn't opened since before the pandemic, Ola actually offered me a pro-sanitized vehicle. I was like, all right, only a little bit more expensive. That's fine. And then the app continuously sent these messages, as you can see, I've put them on the slide here, about how clean the car is, about how clean the driver was going to be, about the fact that we would be isolated from the driver, we'd be riding in the back seat, that there would be a barrier between the front seat and the back seat so that the driver would be isolated from us. And so all of this messaging from this app really shows the basic transition we're making from a sharing economy, which was powering along before the pandemic. But all of a sudden, in the pandemic, sharing is now seen as a way of being able to spread germs. And so all businesses, but particularly sharing businesses, are now starting to make this very careful turn from a sharing economy to a sterile economy. And so this idea, this thinking, that process is going to dominate a lot of the way we think about how we're doing business, particularly through to the end of 2020. The first business to really understand what to do to transition to a sterile economy was the National Rugby League. Now, I know this talk is going out to Melbourne, and the AFL is back this week. I am a big AFL fan. I'm very glad about this. But the NRL were the first ones to actually grasp this. And even as the pandemic was peaking and raging in Australia, they were putting out feelers going, actually, we would like to get back to this. We'd like to be able to get back to playing. When they first raised this idea, people laughed. But when they raised that idea, they also made it very clear that they had already hired a biosecurity officer. Now, biosecurity officer is something you might be familiar with in agriculture, but in normal business and certainly in sport, it's not something that you'd ever needed to consider before. But that biosecurity officer and the team that they brought in created a plan for the NRL that created a sterile field around the players, around the coaches, around the venues that they would be playing in. And that plan was then presented to all of the various stakeholders, so the players' union, the coaches, the venue owners, and then the governments and the broadcasters and the referees. Every one of them had to buy into the plan, and the plan actually went through several upgrades during that process. But what we saw was how an organization could collaborate with its stakeholders in order to produce a plan that would provide safety for everyone involved and also provide a way forward for them to operate as a business. So the NRL has really set a template for how other businesses are going to be able to operate as they transition back to work during the chronic phase of the pandemic. And of course, that's gone very well. But the thing that it's telling us is that now in 2020, all of a sudden, every business is a health business. Every business is now suddenly responsible for making sure that its employees stay well on the job, that they don't get infected, that they're working in safe conditions, that they're working and getting to work in safe conditions. Now, so if that means that they have to commute in a car, where do they park it? How do they get into the office? How do they get up in the elevator? If they're taking public transport, what are the kinds of exposures there? What about the supply chain? What about their customers? What about their vendors? All of these are now considerations for a business that never really had to give a second thought to any of those particular areas where they affected health. And so this set of responsibilities inside of the organization, which will dominate until there is a vaccine, this set of associations is going to be codified within a role within the organization. Now, the NRL called it a biosecurity officer. I think we're going to see a transition into something a little bit different. Let me explain how that might look. So this is me going to visit my local Apple store in Sydney last week. I was picking up an adapter for one of my computers. And I had an appointment to pick up the adapter because I'd purchased it online. And as soon as I arrive in front of the store, they do two things. They take my temperature, 36.6, fine temperature, and they handed me a mask and asked me to put it on, and I waited in a socially distanced queue in front of the store. And I'm looking at the store. There's the store. So the store is basically letting one person in for each customer representative. So each Apple genius is basically fetching one person out of the queue, bringing them into the store, working with them, and taking them out again. All of the Apple employees are also sitting there wearing masks. Many of them are also wearing gloves, particularly if they're doing something that's touching the same equipment that a customer is using. And so what Apple has done here, and they're doing this around the world, is they've engineered an environment which is safe for their employees and safe for their customers, but more than that, is visibly safe for their employees and visibly safe for their customers. There's going to be what we will call sterile theater. Not only do you have to be safe, you have to look like you're being safe while you're being safe. And Apple has been really good at this. Now, they are clearly not getting the kind of traffic. That store is normally jam-packed with people any time of day. There's just people there because it's an Apple store, and they tend to be very busy places. But if you're taking a look at retail going forward, how retail has to rethink what it's doing during the pandemic, this is not a bad model to copy. And again, they got input from a biosecurity officer around how to design this process to be safe for their employees, safe for their customers, and also visibly signal that it's safe. Now, this is going to be such an important thing inside organizations that organizations are going to appoint someone with this responsibility. That person is going to have responsibility not just for the health of the workers and the customers and the supply chain, but for transforming all of the business processes responsible for that. Because business processes will have to change. We'll have to socially distance in offices. We'll have to develop new commuting strategies, new connecting strategies. People won't be flying around as much, new ways of interacting with customers. All of those things are going to produce fundamental business practice transformation. And that biosecurity officer is going to start to develop basically so much importance, so much both power and responsibility inside the organization that within the next several months, they're going to be elevated to the C-suite. Some organizations will call them the chief health officer. Others will call them the chief wellness officer, but it will be the person responsible for maintaining the health and safety of the organization, at least for the duration of the pandemic. And that is a role of tremendous responsibility. And also, because it's got such tremendous responsibility, will then be answerable to the CEO and the board as a C-suite role. So this is something we can expect to see sort of within the next several months. And I'd be very surprised if there weren't some people who are already listening to this, who are already well on the way, bringing in biosecurity officers and slowly transitioning that role to chief health and chief wellness officers. Now, that said, organizations have to function within the world as it is. And we got to see a really good example of the kind of tensions that can be produced around this last week when the AFL complained that the ASADA, this is the drug testers who work with the AFL to make sure that the players are not taking performance-enhancing drugs, that the ASADA monitors are not going to be bound by the same biosecurity protocols around isolation and safety that the players and the teams and the coaches and the venues will. And the AFL's like, we went to all of this trouble. We're trying to produce this sterile field so that the players don't get infected. And you folks have the right to walk in, and not just walk in, but spend a lot of time with the players. And you don't have to be biosafe yourselves. And so these are the kinds of points the chief health officer will be charged with negotiating, because this is the kind of thing that we're going to see over and over again. It's where the desire to keep organizations safe and sterile conflicts with everything else that's going on in the world. And the further we get into this, the more obvious these conflicts will become. Now, one thing that will be a big aspect of this entire business process reengineering, and we'll touch the CFO's office very directly, is what we call the rise of contactless culture. One of the things that was very clear, even from March during the pandemic, is that Google saw an enormous uptick in the number of people who were searching for the term, can I clean money from Australia, which I find kind of funny because we have plastic money. We probably have some of the easiest money to clean in the world. But Australians were actually suddenly very conscious of the fact that money had been carried by other people, that coins had been carried by other people, and banknotes had been carried by other people, and that these were potentially vectors for the transmission of disease. And this was roughly the point when Australians, by and large, made a decision to stop using cash. And so pretty much all of the places in Australia that could started accepting digital payments, whether that's a tap and pay or credit card, whatever it might be. But we actually got this enormous acceleration into a cashless culture. And that seems to be sticking even in the chronic pandemic environment. We seem to be sticking to this idea of not using physical cash as much as possible in every situation. So all organizations that hadn't necessarily been geared up for that kind of digital payments are thinking about redesigning their business processes around those kinds of digital payments. Digital payments are only the most visible aspect of contactless culture because, again, the chief health officer will be taking a look at every business practice and figuring out where those contact points are, in other words, where those infection points will be, and then doing what they can to move those away, redesign the business process to move them away. And the other thing that it's done is it's sped up the transition not just to a digital payments economy, but it sped up the transition to digital banking. So digital banking and neobanking has been growing slowly in Australia over the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a lot of new regulations, a lot of new neobanks have launched. I think there's still probably 20 in the queue that are getting close to launching at this point with all sorts of services. Some are geared to business, some are geared to consumer. Those took off enormously again during the pandemic because you didn't have to worry about going into a branch to do anything. So the idea of contactless, which is part of the structure of a digital bank and digital banking, was leaned into by the pandemic because it was already contactless. So we have this idea that, in fact, financial services, to the degree that it is possible, will rapidly move to completely contactless. And of course, we all know, because we've all been doing it, work from home is another aspect of contactless culture. And the question now is, as we enter the chronic phase of the pandemic, what does that mean for our work in offices? Do we continue our work in offices as we have been, or do we continue to work from home? Where do we sit on this? And there's a lovely chart that was published last week that shows you the relative ease with which different kinds of businesses can be done remotely, can be done at home, versus the number that require face-to-face interaction. Of course, the top of these are going to be software and finance. That these are the ones that will work the most easily across remote interactions, across contactless interactions, across what the chief health officer will say are the safest sorts of interactions. Then you have retail at the bottom. And of course, if you take a look at what happened with what Apple was doing everything it could to make sure that people, in fact, saw that retail situation as safe as something that was being done remotely, finance or software and IT. So the pressure to resume working in an office for, say, an Atlassian, or even for a bank, although Westpac has announced today that they're going to be bringing employees back into their offices, the pressure is not going to be as great. And so we're now going to have a long-term change, which has been kicked off by what we've seen here in the pandemic, in the acute phase of the pandemic, we're now going to see something that looks a lot more like a gradual transition to work. And so you now have this idea that work from home, which is really work from anywhere, will stick around much longer in finance than it will in other areas of the business and in other areas of the economy, both because the chief health officer will advise that it is safer, but also because, in fact, one of the unexpected things is that we found out that people are more productive, something between 10 and 20% more productive when they're working from home, which throws into doubt a lot of assumptions people had been making that people would simply slack off when they were working from home. Turns out, in fact, quite the opposite was true about this. And so one of the questions that CFOs will now be asking themselves in this span through the rest of 2020 is, if we continue to work from home, if finance is judged to be safer as a function when it's done remotely, and if we're all having just lots of video conferences and things like this, how do we then maintain the connection? How do we maintain the esprit de corps? How do we maintain and grow the corporate culture in a remote working environment? And these are not questions that many organizations have had to grapple with before. These are not questions that necessarily yield very easy answers, because the kinds of things that work well when you're face-to-face in an office don't work nearly as well when you're a bunch of squares on a screen together. And then we come to the last of the four trends, the bubble. Now, yesterday was a day of jubilation in New Zealand, because in New Zealand they've declared themselves effectively COVID-free, and there were pictures of people dancing. They've gone back to life as it was lived before the pandemic. They can actually meet. They don't have to be doing a conference online. They could actually all meet in one room together, as many people as wanted. They'll be able to go to the rugby starting this week. All of the things that we associated with life pre-COVID are now happening inside New Zealand. But there's a price there. And the price for that is that New Zealand is now effectively isolated from all of the rest of the world. New Zealand is now living inside a bubble. And there are problems with that. As has been pointed out, 5% of the entire New Zealand economy comes from international tourism. And all of that has entirely gone away and will be going away until further notice, because although the bubble is a great thing to be living in, it also completely isolates you from the rest of the world. Well, almost completely, because again, even here within this perfect bubble, there are economic considerations. And so 2 weeks ago, there was quite a fuss being made because, in fact, New Zealand, which has been very grudging on who they'll admit into the country right now, in fact, admitted the entire cast and crew of the Avatar sequel that's being filmed in Wellington at Weta Studios, because the threat was made that if they didn't open it up, if they didn't let those people in, even though those people are now being quarantined, they're in a 2-week quarantine, if they didn't let those people in, that work would be taken away, and that would be a huge economic loss to New Zealand. And so all of these bubbles are going to come up against the pressures of actually trying to sustain life, because the problem with a bubble is that there's a fixed amount of air in it. And eventually, you're going to run out of air if you're just breathing the same air in the bubble all of the time. And that kind of tension is basically going to dominate all of the rest of the year. And so, here in Australia, we still have bubbles between the states. We still have bubbles here. We haven't started to lower our bubbles yet. Queensland's in a bubble. Western Australia's in a bubble. And in fact, it seems like Western Australia is in no hurry to get out of its bubble, like sort of being part of and not part of Australia. And so we need to start to think about what it means. What are the prices that we're going to pay? Yes, the bubble offers safety. But in fact, in a world with a raging pandemic, all of that safety is provisional, and all of that safety comes at a cost. And it's even true here in Sydney, because in fact, we set up everything in the city for workers to be able to drive in, to be able to park their cars, and then go into town. It hasn't happened yet. So even here in Sydney, we don't really want to get away from the comforts or the safety of the bubble of being at home. And so what we're going to see now is that the world outside the bubble is going to look really clean, and the world inside the bubble, it's going to get a little stale. But of course, as soon as you open up the bubble, you let the virus in. And that whole tension is going to drive most business thinking through the end of 2020. All right, here's the thing. We kind of have a roadmap through to the year. We understand the different ways that the pandemic is going to shape our business practice and our business thinking. But the one thing that I can promise you is that even as we take all of these steps, we are engaged in a gigantic experiment. We actually don't yet know what works and what doesn't work, and we're only going to know by trying things and having them either succeed or blow up in our face. And what that means is that we need to plan, but we also need to accept the reality that the goalposts are going to move all of the time right now. That is just the nature of this entirely unpredictable period of time. This is the reason I can't give you a 5 or a 10-year view. All I can do is say there's a reasonable chance that for the next 6 months, conditions will be reasonably the same as they are today. Reasonably. But the goalposts are going to move. And what does that mean? It means that planning is now a continuous cycle. Planning is not something you do for each financial year. Planning is something you take a look at constantly. You're constantly revising your plans. You heard the speakers on the panel talking that way. That is absolutely an approach we need to adopt. And the benefit of that is that as we actually exit the pandemic, when there is a vaccine, when we can actually have fully open borders again, the companies that will have thrived by practicing continuous planning will be in the best place in the world going forward. So what we need to do is to experiment, we need to learn, we need to accept that there's going to be a lot of change in our practices. We need to build that into our planning models. And if we do that, then we can actually have a pandemic that is a positive as well as a danger. Thank you.